So far we've been talking about consideration, and what we've said is that it must be present in a contract. It can take many different forms. It's not just about money or goods or service. It can be not doing something. That it must move from the promisor, but not necessarily to the promisee, and that it must be present even if not sufficient. Having said that, it doesn't mean that anything can be consideration. There are some kind of lower limits or things that won't meet the threshold of consideration. And what are those things? They include a vague promise, past consideration is not good consideration, and a prior legal obligation is not good consideration. So let's talk about those in a little more detail. So a vague promise, what we're really dealing with here is circumstances where what is promised as the consideration is too vague or really no legal value whatsoever. And so you can see on the slide here, we've got the case of White and Blewett, where a father promised to forgive the debt of a son if the son agreed to stop complaining to the father about his actions. So what they said is really here, that's not got any legal value whatsoever. So there has to be some form of value that the courts can see. And in this case, they were saying, well, it's really got no legal value at all. A better example, probably commercially, of a vague promise is the case of development and the Commonwealth. And what we had happen in this instance was a company went up to New Guinea and was going to promise to bring some wood products into Australia. And as part of that deal, the Commonwealth promised that it would pay a subsidy with respect to the customs duties that were liable of an amount or a rate determined by the Commonwealth from time to time. Now they're very vague words when you think about it, an amount or a rate that will be determined by the Commonwealth from time to time. And it was so vague that the court said that, that's not a consideration. There is just no way we can work out how much that is. So we've got to be careful that consideration is not too vague, that it's certain enough, and that it does hold some value. Now the next one is one of the hardest areas in consideration. It has to deal with past consideration. This can be hard when you've got a promise for a promise, etc. You've got to look at when the contract's formed and to understand whether the promise was made prior to the agreement. Okay, so this is where timing becomes critical. We can see that in the simple example that we have on this slide here, where we've got someone who works for a day, and then at the end of the day, if the boss promises a bonus, that's not legally enforceable. Why? Because the person's already worked. Right? They've already done their part of the deal. As part of their deal, they are entitled to their pay, but the bonus is, well, what's the person who's working offered for that bonus? We could argue nothing, right? Their work's done. They've already done it. So in that case, their work is past consideration, and that's not good consideration from a legal perspective, and so they wouldn't be entitled to the bonus. How about we have a look at the case of Roskella and Thomas about this. So again, just to reiterate that a lot of this issue here is about timing when we're dealing with past consideration when things occur. So we've got our two parties involved, Roskella and Thomas, and it all has to do with buying and selling a horse. So I've got my horse there, beautifully drawn with the mane and the tail. Okay, so we've got our horse that's going to be sold, and Thomas is selling the horse to Roskella. Now, what happens is that the money changes hands for the horse. So Roskella pays, and let's just say he pays $20, and the horse goes over here. And then what happens? Then Roskella asks, is the horse vicious? Will the horse bite him, etc.? Now notice the important thing here is that it's happened after the sale. So the first thing we did was the $20 went and the horse went. The second thing that occurs is Roskella then asks, is the horse vicious? To which Thomas replies, no. But guess what? The horse was vicious. So Roskella tried to get out of the contract and get damages and say, look, you promised me that the horse wasn't vicious, and it was. Now, what did the courts hold here? The courts held that really that was just a promise and not part of the contract, because the contract had concluded, and that this second part was just a second promise. Is the horse vicious? No. And that actually Roskella had provided no consideration for that promise. And because there was no consideration, there was no legally enforceable contract here. Now, the most complicated part about past consideration is you've got to separate the kind of situation that we've just dealt with in Roskella and Thomas from a situation where you give consideration in anticipation of a contract. Now, if you give consideration in anticipation of a future legal contract, then what you'll find is that when you have that second contract, the first consideration, which we normally go as past consideration, is sufficient consideration. Okay, so the timing gets us part of the way there, but then we also have to ask, but did they do that for the second promise that they get? So a case, again, might help us understand this a bit better. So we have two parties again. The first party to this is Hosking, and the second party that we have is IPEX Software Services Limited, so ISS. Let's do ISS. And the situation, the name of this case is IPEX Software Services and Hosking. So there are our two parties, ISS and Hosking. So Hosking and the person in charge of IPEX Software, they negotiate an agreement where Hosking is going to sell to ISS his own software business in turn for some shares in ISS. So they're negotiating a deal, and they haven't got an agreement, but the deal was going to be Hosking's company goes to ISS, and ISS gives a share in the company. So on the facts established in the court, that's the kind of deal that they're actually talking about. So what happened? This negotiation happens, but before there's any agreement or contract, Hosking transfers the company. Okay, so you can see that Hosking transfers the company, and then after that transfer's occurred, ISS offers the 5% company ownership. So the transfer happens. So number one, we have these negotiations talking about what the deal's going to be. Then second, the transfer occurs, and then at a distinct point in time, the offer, so it's only an offer for 5% ownership, and ISS did not fulfill this, so they didn't transfer the 5% across. ISS then sought to argue that they tried to say, hey, this transfer of the company, there was no deal, right? We actually didn't have a deal there. So our offer, the offer of 5% had no corresponding consideration from Hosking. Just like the horse scenario, they're trying to say, look, Hosking gave us the company, and then at a later time we said, we'll do this, but you know what, we decided not to. And by that time we've already got the company. There was no legal agreement here. We've already got this transfer in. So you can't say that we made this offer in reliance of getting the company sold to us, because we already had it. It was past consideration. Well, what the court decided, and you can imagine is really quite fair, was that although Hosking had transferred the business across before this promise was actually made. He actually did it in request and on the expectation that ISS would offer this part of the company ownership. You know, there are a whole lot of facts there about them having talked about it. So just because the formal promise hadn't come across, he had actually made this transfer expecting this to occur. And in this instance, the comptrollers or the controller of ISS, their promise was enforceable because it was made in reliance or expectation of the promise. So that can be quite a tricky area for you to work out.